It was an ordinary Monday morning when Jamila's world was torn apart. The day had started like any other, with the usual rush of teenagers filling the hallways of Oakwood High, the familiar chatter of friends exchanging stories of their weekend, and the dull hum of the overhead lights. Jamila, a 16-year-old with dreams bigger than her small town, was preparing for another day of school. She loved the library, her safe haven, where she could escape the harshness of the world and immerse herself in books, art, and her passion for painting. Her teachers admired her, and her classmates respected her for her quiet strength. But all of that was about to change. Jamila had just sat down in her history class, her eyes scanning the textbook in front of her, when she was called to the principal's office. It was unusual but not alarming. She had always been a model student, quiet, respectful, and hardworking. As she walked down the hall to Mr. Lewis' office, her heart beat a little faster, wondering what could be so urgent. When she stepped into his office, the room felt colder than usual, the air thick with unspoken tension. Mr. Lewis, a man in his late 40s with a rigid, authoritarian presence, sat behind his large wooden desk. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on a stack of papers before him. "Jamila," he said curtly, not even looking up. "Take a seat." She hesitated for a moment before sitting down in the chair across from him. She could feel her palms beginning to sweat. What could this be about? He never called her into his office, and she had done nothing wrong. "I'm afraid I have some bad news," Mr. Lewis continued, his voice cold and distant. "Effective immediately, you're being expelled from Oakwood High." Jamila's heart skipped a beat, the words echoing in her head, but she couldn't comprehend them. "What? No? There's some mistake. I haven't done anything wrong, sir." Her voice trembled with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Mr. Lewis finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a cold, calculated gaze. "It's not a mistake, Jamila. You've been caught violating the school's rules, and after careful consideration, I've made the decision to expel you. There's no appeal." The shock of hearing the words was enough to leave Jamila momentarily speechless. "But I don't even know what I did. Please, I need to understand." He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "You've been involved in multiple incidents that have disrupted the school environment. I've had enough of your behavior." The dismissal in his voice was unmistakable. Jamila sat there, her mind racing, trying to grasp what he was saying. "I've never caused trouble. I keep to myself. I just want to graduate and leave. This doesn't make sense." "Your actions are what caused this," Mr. Lewis said flatly. "You've broken the rules, and now you must face the consequences. You'll need to leave the premises immediately." He stood up, signaling the end of the conversation, and Jamila could feel the finality in his voice. It wasn't a request, it was an order. She stood up too, still in shock, trying to process what had just happened. "Please, sir, I'm begging you. I've worked so hard. You can't just throw my future away like this." But Mr. Lewis wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had already turned back to the papers on his desk, signaling that the conversation was over. He didn't see the hurt, the confusion, the dreams crashing down in front of him. To him, Jamila was just another student who had crossed a line, another problem to deal with. He had made up his mind long before she walked in, and nothing would change that. Jamila stood there for a moment longer, rooted to the spot, her mind numb as she tried to find some way out of this nightmare. But there was none. With a final glance at the principal's indifferent face, she turned and walked out of his office, her legs feeling weak beneath her. The hallways seemed different now, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She couldn't understand what had just happened. Her chest tightened with panic. She needed to talk to her mother, to someone who could make sense of this. But even as the shock began to fade into anger, she knew it wouldn't change the fact that she was no longer a student at Oakwood High. As Jamila walked through the school's front doors for the last time, the weight of the decision hung heavily in the air. Outside, the sky was clear, the sun bright, But Jamila could feel none of it. All she could feel was the cold emptiness of Mr. Lewis' words echoing in her head. Her future was slipping through her fingers, and she didn't even know why. Her mother would never believe it. No one would. The injustice was suffocating. Back in the principal's office, Mr. Lewis sat back down and stared at his computer screen, his mind already moving on to the next task. He had made a decision, an important one, in his eyes, but he had no idea how deeply it would shake the very foundation of Oakwood High and the community beyond. In those next few moments, something shifted, though no one could have known it then. The storm was just beginning, and it would soon come crashing down on everyone involved. Jamila's life had just taken a sharp turn, and nothing would be the same again. The news of Jamila's expulsion spread like wildfire throughout Oakwood High. Within hours, rumors flew through the school halls, and students began whispering in disbelief. Jamila, a quiet, hard-working student who had always kept to herself, had been expelled. It didn't make sense. Some of the students who had been closest to her could hardly believe it. Her friends, Maya and Chris, were the first to show their support. They both knew Jamila had always kept a low profile, had never caused trouble. She wasn't the type to break the rules, much less the type to get expelled. Yet there was no denying it. Jamila had been called into the principal's office, and just hours later, she was gone. The backlash from the student body was immediate. A group of Jamila's friends began an unofficial campaign to bring attention to the unfairness of the decision. They made posters, passed out flyers, and started a petition demanding her reinstatement. What did she really do? They asked. What's the real reason she was kicked out? These questions burned in the minds of many, and soon more students were getting involved. Jamila, however, didn't know where to begin. She had gone from feeling confused and lost to feeling an intense, fiery need for justice. But where could she turn for help? Her mother, Karen, was furious, but even she was at a loss. She had tried to speak with Mr. Lewis, but he had refused to meet with her. His response had been cold and unyielding, almost as if he were hiding something. Karen was a woman of strength, a single mother who had raised Jamila on her own, working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. She wasn't about to let her daughter be wronged without a fight, but she could feel the weight of the situation. Her daughter's future was on the line. It wasn't just the students who were beginning to question the fairness of Jamila's expulsion. The local community also started to take notice. News outlets in the town had caught wind of the story, and what had initially seemed like an isolated school issue soon became the topic of local debate. People on both sides of the fence began to voice their opinions, some claiming Jamila deserved to be expelled, while others argued that the principal's decision was biased and unjust. But the community was divided. Jamila was black, and the truth was hard to ignore. This wasn't just about a student breaking the rules. It was about race, power, and the hidden prejudices lurking beneath the surface of a supposedly fair system. The whispers of inequality spread quickly as more and more people began to question whether Jamila's expulsion was the result of a genuine violation or if there was something deeper at play. One morning, as Jamila sat at the kitchen table with her mother, the phone rang. Karen picked it up, only to find herself speaking with a local journalist who had caught wind of the story. The journalist, Sam Carter, was known in the community for his hard-hitting articles, and he had a reputation for uncovering the truth. He was interested in interviewing Karen for a piece on Jamila's expulsion, wanting to get the perspective of a concerned mother. "Mrs. Johnson, we want to cover your daughter's case. I believe something's not right here. Jamila's expulsion doesn't make sense. I'm sure you've heard the rumors. Some people are saying this could be about more than just a rule violation." Karen's heart skipped a beat. Was this the breakthrough they needed? She agreed to meet with Sam that afternoon, feeling both nervous and hopeful. She had spent the last few days trying to process everything, but it felt like the world was moving faster than she could keep up with. The idea of her daughter's life being altered by a single unsubstantiated accusation gnawed at her. She had to make people listen. She had to make sure Jamila's side of the story was heard. As the interview took place, Karen did her best to explain the situation, but she knew it wasn't enough. She spoke of Jamila's dedication to her studies, her love for art, and how hard she had worked to overcome the struggles that life had thrown her way. She shared how Jamila had always kept her head down, trying to stay out of trouble. There was no way her daughter was guilty of whatever Mr. Lewis had accused her of. By the time the article was published the next morning, the entire town was buzzing with the story. Sam Carter's piece painted a picture of a girl who had been unfairly punished, someone who had been caught up in a system that didn't care for her. The article raised suspicions about the fairness of the decision, questioning whether there was more to the expulsion than Mr. Lewis was letting on. It wasn't just an injustice. It was a story that echoed the struggles of many in the community who had faced similar discrimination, and it resonated deeply with those who had been quiet for too long. The article sparked a wave of support for Jamila. In the following days, rallies began to form in front of Oakwood High, with students, teachers, and even parents demanding answers. Signs reading "Justice for Jamila" and "Reinstate our student" filled the air as the community began to rally behind her. People who had once been silent were now speaking up, no longer willing to sit by and watch an innocent young girl's future be destroyed without cause. Yet, the more the community rallied, the more Jamila began to feel the weight of what she was up against. It wasn't just the principle she had to fight. It was the very system that had allowed this to happen in the first place. It was clear now that this wasn't just a school issue. It was a battle for justice, for fairness, and for the truth. As the days passed, Jamila became a symbol of resilience for the town, but the emotional toll it took on her was undeniable. She hadn't asked for this fight, yet now it was hers to bear, and she was determined not to let the darkness of the situation swallow her. But the twists were only beginning. Just when it seemed that Jamila might have a chance to return to school, an unexpected development would change everything. What Jamila didn't know was that Mr. Lewis had a secret, one that could potentially bring down the entire foundation of the town's educational system. But for now, the stage was set, and Jamila's fight for justice had only just begun. The momentum behind Jamila's cause continued to build. Her story, amplified by the local media, soon caught the attention of a wider audience. People from all walks of life, not just students or parents from Oakwood High, began to stand behind her. The hashtag #JusticeForJamila went viral, trending on local social media platforms. Rallies were held, peaceful protests outside the school became a daily occurrence, and signs calling for Mr. Lewis' Karen looked at her, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Mrs. Parker hesitated for a moment, glancing around to make sure no one was paying attention. "I don't know all the details, but I've seen things in the past few years that I can't ignore anymore. Mr. Lewis, he's had it out for Jamila for a while now. There are whispers that he's been making decisions based on more than just the rules." Karen's blood ran cold. "Are you saying this is about race?" Mrs. Parker nodded slowly. "I've been in education long enough to know when something doesn't add up. There's been a pattern. Jamila's not the first student to face unfair treatment under his leadership, especially when it comes to students of color." The words hit Karen like a punch to the gut. Her worst fears were being confirmed. She had always suspected that there was more to Jamila's expulsion than met the eye, but hearing it from someone who had worked closely with Mr. Lewis for years made it real. It was as if the very foundation of the school was built on a lie, and Jamila had become its most recent victim. Armed with this new information, Karen went straight to the school district's office, determined to get answers. She was no longer just asking for her daughter's reinstatement. She was demanding an investigation into the principal's actions. But when she arrived, she found herself facing a wall of bureaucracy. The district officials were polite, but dismissive, telling her that the matter was internal and couldn't be discussed with outsiders. "Your daughter's expulsion is a school matter, Mrs. Johnson," one official told her, his voice dripping with condescension. "We have procedures in place to address these things. I'm sure Mr. Lewis has made the right decision. Karen, frustrated and disillusioned, pushed back. You can't just sweep this under the rug. My daughter's life is being ruined, and you're telling me there's nothing you can do. Are you really going to ignore the fact that this could be a case of racial discrimination? The official shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding eye contact. We're not ignoring anything. The school board will look into it, but it's not something that can be resolved overnight. These processes take time. Time. That was something Jamila didn't have. Her future, her dreams, were slipping through her fingers, and all the district could offer was empty words. As Karen left the office, her heart sank. It was becoming clear that the system was stacked against them, and the people who could make the change were either too afraid or too apathetic to act. Meanwhile, the pressure on Mr. Lewis was building. His previously unshakable authority had begun to crumble under the weight of the public outcry. His actions had sparked a firestorm of controversy, and while he tried to remain silent, the pressure was beginning to take its toll. His colleagues were whispering behind his back, and students were openly defying him. The principal, who had once commanded respect with his no-nonsense approach, now found himself in an impossible situation. His reputation, carefully built over the years, was quickly falling apart. But it wasn't just the community or the teachers that were turning against him. The school board, which had once been a silent ally to his authority, was now beginning to question his decisions. It started with small murmurs in the board meetings, concerns raised about the fairness of his disciplinary actions, particularly when it came to students of color. And then, during a closed-door meeting, the hammer finally fell. Mr. Lewis's long-hidden secrets were beginning to surface. It wasn't just Jamila's case that was being scrutinized. There were other students who had been unfairly disciplined, some of whom had filed complaints that had gone ignored. The board, seeing the growing public dissatisfaction and the weight of the allegations against him, launched a formal investigation into his conduct. As the investigation began, the pieces of the puzzle slowly started to fall into place. Former students, too afraid to speak up before, now came forward with their own stories of unjust punishment. Teachers who had remained silent for years began to share their accounts of Mr. Lewis's increasingly biased behavior. It was clear now. Mr. Lewis had created an environment where rules were selectively enforced, where students of color were disproportionately punished, and where power was used to silence those who dared to speak out. But even as the truth started to unravel, Mr. Lewis refused to back down. He continued to deny any wrongdoing, blaming everyone but himself for the controversy. But it was no longer just about Jamila. It was about something much bigger. The truth was catching up to him, and soon, the entire school district would have to reckon with the consequences of his actions. For Jamila, the world seemed to be falling apart. She had gone from a quiet student with dreams of a bright future to the center of a storm she couldn't control. But as the weeks went on, she realized something important. She wasn't alone. The support from her friends, from the community, and even from unexpected sources was growing. And though the battle was far from over, Jamila was beginning to find her voice in a way she never had before. The fight for her future was just beginning, and she was ready to stand up for herself, no matter the cost. As the investigation into Mr. Lewis's conduct unfolded, the entire town was caught in the whirlwind of controversy. Jamila's story had sparked a fire, and now it was impossible to ignore the long-standing issues within Oakwood High. For Jamila and her family, the battle was no longer just about her reinstatement. It had become a fight for justice that was larger than one student's fate. Karen could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her, but she also felt a growing sense of purpose. The injustice that had been done to her daughter wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of mistreatment and inequality in their community. She knew she had to keep pushing, even when it seemed like the odds were against them. The pressure on the school district intensified. With every passing day, more stories of unfair treatment came to light. Former students who had felt silenced for years began to step forward. Some had been expelled for minor infractions, Others had faced disproportionate discipline, and a few shared stories of outright discriminatory behavior from Mr. Lewis. The town, once divided on the issue, now seemed to rally around Jamila and her family. The local news outlets continued to cover the unfolding scandal, and as the story gained national attention, the pressure mounted. The public demanded accountability, and Mr. Lewis found himself in an increasingly precarious position. But as the community's support for Jamila grew, so did the hostility from the principal's camp. Mr. Lewis, refusing to acknowledge the wrongdoing, doubled down on his stance. He claimed that Jamila's expulsion had nothing to do with race, that it was merely a matter of discipline and the violation of school rules. But the more he spoke, the more it became clear that he was trying to protect his own interests, not the well-being of the students he was supposed to serve. One evening, as Karen sat in the living room, flipping through the news coverage on her phone rang. It was a local reporter she hadn't spoken to before, someone named Greg Davis, who had been following the story closely. He told Karen he had information that could change everything. "I've been digging into Mr. Lewis's past, and there's something I think you should know," Greg said. "There are records, documents from his time as a principal at a school in another district. They show a pattern of biased disciplinary actions, especially towards students of color. These aren't just isolated incidents, Mrs. Johnson. This could be much bigger than just Jamila's expulsion." Karen's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected there was more to the story than met the eye, but hearing it confirmed was a shock. If what Greg was saying was true, it meant that Mr. Lewis's actions weren't just part of a poor decision-making process. They were part of a long history of discriminatory behavior. Karen quickly agreed to meet with Greg to learn more, her heart racing as she thought about what this new information could mean for Jamila. The next day, Karen and Greg met at a local cafe, the air thick with anticipation. Greg slid a folder across the table, its contents marked with official stamps and dates. As Karen flipped through the papers, her eyes widened. The documents detailed several incidents where Mr. Lewis had unfairly disciplined students of color, citing minor infractions as grounds for suspension or expulsion, while white students had received much lighter consequences for similar behavior. The records were damning, but it wasn't just the actions themselves that were troubling. It was the pattern that emerged. Mr. Lewis had a history of targeting students from lower-income backgrounds, especially those from single-parent households. "I don't know how far this will go," Greg said quietly, his voice laced with concern. "But this information could change everything. If you can get the right people to listen, it might just be the tipping point that brings Mr. Lewis down for good." Karen's hands trembled as she absorbed the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about Jamila anymore. This was about every student who had been unfairly punished, every parent who had been ignored, and every teacher who had watched from the sidelines. She felt a renewed sense of purpose surge within her. She had to act, and she had to act quickly. Back at Oakwood High, the investigation continued, but the atmosphere was growing increasingly tense. The school board had started to question Mr. Lewis's judgment, and several teachers had quietly expressed their concerns to the district. The pressure was becoming unbearable. Mr. Lewis's public statements became more defensive, and his attempts to paint himself as a victim fell flat in the face of mounting evidence. One morning, during a particularly heated board meeting, the final straw came. A group of former students showed up, all of them with stories to tell about their experiences under Mr. Lewis's rule. Some had been punished for things as trivial as being a few minutes late to class, while others had faced harsher treatment for speaking out about their treatment. One by one, they took the stand, recounting their experiences in heartbreaking detail. The room fell silent as each person shared their story, and it became clear that the problem was not an isolated case. It was systemic. When it was Jamila's turn to speak, she stood tall, her voice steady despite the emotions bubbling up inside her. "I didn't break any rules," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "But I was punished because of the color of my skin. I was punished because I didn't fit into Mr. Lewis's idea of what a student should be. I deserve the same chance as everyone else to learn, to grow, to succeed. I want my future back." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for the first time, the room was silent, not out of hostility, but out of realization. The people in that room knew the truth now, and the truth could not be ignored. The following days were a blur. The school board, facing mounting public pressure and undeniable evidence, finally made a decision. Mr. Lewis was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. The community was in shock, but it was also in disbelief that it had come to this point. Jamila's future hung in the balance, but the power dynamics that had allowed Mr. Lewis's reign to go unchecked for so long were beginning to crumble. Jamila and Karen knew that this victory was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and there were still obstacles to overcome, but they had already done what so many had said was impossible. They had started to dismantle a system that was designed to keep people like Jamila from succeeding. In the days that followed, Jamila felt a sense of clarity she had never felt before. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every student who had been unfairly punished, every person who had been silenced, and every voice that had been ignored. And in that fight, she would find her strength, her voice, and her future. The world, it seemed, was finally ready to listen. As Jamila and Karen navigated the aftermath of Mr. Lewis's suspension, the weight of their journey was becoming more apparent with every passing day. The media frenzy, the growing support from the community, and the public hearings were all signs that things were changing. Yet for Jamila, it wasn't just the legal battle she was facing. It was the emotional toll of everything she had been through. What had begun as a simple misunderstanding had turned into a full-blown confrontation with a system that had long overlooked the struggles of people like her. Her name was now synonymous with resilience, but that didn't make the days any easier. The school board had issued a temporary decision to reinstate Jamila as a student at Oakwood High, pending the full outcome of the investigation into Mr. Lewis's conduct. While this was a victory, Jamila's world felt fundamentally different. She returned to class with a sense of unease, as if the walls of Oakwood no longer held the promise of security they once did. Her classmates who had once been supportive now viewed her through a different lens. Some praised her for standing up against injustice, while others whispered behind her back, skeptical of her sudden rise to prominence. The tension in the air was palpable, and Jamila couldn't shake the feeling that she was an outsider in her own school. At home, Karen did her best to keep the household running smoothly, but even she couldn't deny that the battle was taking its toll. The constant media attention, the protests, the interviews, it all felt like too much at times. But Karen knew there was no turning back now. The fight for Jamila's future, and the truth about Mr. Lewis's actions, had reached a boiling point. They had come too far to back down. But Mr. Lewis wasn't going down quietly. Despite being placed on leave, he had a cadre of supporters within the district. Teachers who still believed in his leadership and staff members who were reluctant to admit that their principal might have been involved in something darker than they had imagined. For weeks, Mr. Lewis remained largely silent, but as the investigation drew closer to a conclusion, he became more vocal. He began issuing statements through his attorney, claiming that he had been wronged by the board, that Jamila had been a troublemaker from the start, and that the charges against him were fabricated. Then the unthinkable happened. A video surfaced on social media, an old, grainy recording from one of the school's parent-teacher meetings a few years prior. In the footage, Mr. Lewis could be seen making disparaging remarks about the troublemaking black students and expressing his belief that they were more trouble than they were worth. The video was damning, not just for Mr. Lewis, but for the entire administration. It confirmed the suspicions many had had about his treatment of students of color, painting him as not just a biased educator, but a man who had used his position to perpetuate harmful stereotypes. The video sent shockwaves through the town. The board, already under intense pressure, now found themselves in a position where they couldn't ignore the evidence. The district's investigation took on a new urgency, and a few days later, Mr. Lewis was called in for a final meeting. The outcome was inevitable. In a matter of hours, the school district's decision was made public. Mr. Lewis was terminated from his position, effective immediately. The announcement was a victory, not just for Jamila, but for everyone who had stood by her throughout the ordeal. It was a moment of catharsis, as the community rallied around the fact that they had forced change. But as Jamila watched the news coverage that night, she couldn't help but feel that the damage done to her, and to the larger community, couldn't be erased with a simple decision. The decision to fire Mr. Lewis did not signal the end of the battle. It was, in many ways, just the beginning. The public reckoning had exposed the deep-seated issues within the school system, issues that went far beyond one man's discriminatory actions. Jamila's fight for justice had made waves, but the question now was what would happen next. How would Oakwood High, and the broader district, respond to the revelations about Mr. Lewis's conduct? Would this be the catalyst for real, lasting change, or would the school fall back into its old ways? Jamila's return to Oakwood High was bittersweet. On the surface, it seemed like a victory. She was back in school, no longer at the mercy of a principal who had held her future in his hands. But the school was no longer the place of learning it once was. The whispers in the hallways had only grown louder. There were students who viewed her as a hero, but there were also those who resented her for bringing so much unwanted attention to the school. Some teachers now treated her with an air of caution, as if unsure how to relate to her after all the controversy. And yet, in the midst of all the tension, Jamila found a sense of clarity. She no longer feared what others thought of her. The battle she had fought had opened her eyes to the strength she never knew she had. Her mother, ever supportive, reminded her that she had done something extraordinary. You stood up for what was right, Jamila, and no one can ever take that away from you. But Jamila was also becoming more attuned to the ways in which the fight had changed her. Her dreams, once focused solely on her art, now had a broader scope. She had become an advocate, not just for herself, but for others who had been silenced by a system designed to keep them down. She had seen firsthand how power could be abused, how bias could shape the future of young people, and how fragile the path to justice really was. And then, just when Jamila thought the dust was finally settling, another twist came. A member of the school board, a longtime ally of Mr. Lewis, began making public statements that undermined the findings of the investigation. This board member, who had been a key supporter of Mr. Lewis' leadership, suggested that the entire investigation was a politically motivated attack on a man who had only tried to enforce discipline. The town erupted in response, and once again, Jamila found herself at the center of a storm. This time, though, she wasn't afraid. She had learned what it meant to fight, and she had seen what could happen when the community came together to demand change. Jamila wasn't going to let anyone rewrite the narrative now. She had faced down one of the most powerful figures in the school district, and she had won. Now she was prepared for whatever came next. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jamila knew one thing for sure. She would never back down, not for anyone. The final twist in Jamila's journey wasn't just about her future. It was about the future of every student who had ever been told they didn't belong. And with that thought in her mind, she knew that the battle was far from over. As Jamila stood up to speak at another community meeting, she could feel the eyes of the town on her once more. But this time, it wasn't with suspicion or anger. It was with respect. Jamila had become a symbol of the fight for justice, and she was ready to lead the charge into the next chapter of change. The aftermath of Mr. Lewis's firing was a bittersweet victory for Jamila, but it marked the beginning of a much bigger journey. With Oakwood High now under intense scrutiny, the changes that Jamila had fought for started to ripple outward, affecting not just the school but the entire community. For Jamila, the weight of the past few months settled heavily on her shoulders. She had stood up for herself and for countless other students who had faced discrimination without a voice. But the real challenge was just beginning. How could she, a 16-year-old girl, help to reshape a system that had been built to uphold inequality for so long? As she continued her education at Oakwood, things were far from normal. Jamila's name was now known throughout the town, and the echoes of her battle for justice followed her through every classroom and hallway. The same peers who had once barely noticed her now looked at her with a mixture of admiration and expectation. Jamila had become a symbol, not just of resistance, but of change. Some teachers had quietly approached her, offering their support, while others remained distant, unsure of how to treat her in the wake of the scandal. Still, Jamila couldn't let their discomfort deter her. Her place was no longer in the background, blending into the walls of Oakwood High. She had a purpose now. But the challenge wasn't just in the classrooms. In the weeks following the resolution of Mr. Lewis's case, Jamila began to feel the effects of the wider community's reaction. Parents, teachers, and even people from neighboring towns began to call into question the practices at Oakwood High. Some defended Mr. Lewis, claiming that his firing was an overreaction, that he had simply been enforcing discipline as a principal should. They argued that Jamila's case had been blown out of proportion, that the town had been swept up in a media storm and had lost sight of the real issues. These voices of dissent came from all sides of the community, and their criticisms didn't stop with Jamila's fight. They grew louder, seeking to dismiss the very idea of systemic racism that had brought Jamila's battle to the forefront. For Jamila, this created a new kind of weight. She had fought the fight and won, but now she found herself embroiled in a battle to make sure the changes she had won weren't undone by the very forces that had enabled Mr. Lewis's discriminatory behavior. It became clear that while she had confronted one man, she was now facing a much larger fight, one that would demand more than just courage. She would need to continue speaking out, continue pushing for change, and most importantly, continue to stand her ground. In the months that followed, Jamila's role in her community evolved. She began to take on more public speaking engagements, sharing her story not just as a way to continue her own healing process, but to ensure that others knew they weren't alone. Her story had become a rallying cry for students of color, for those who felt marginalized or silenced by systems of power that prioritized conformity over justice. At local community centers and schools, Jamila spoke to young people, encouraging them to find their voices and stand up when they saw something wrong, just as she had. She became an advocate, a young voice for social change in a community that had never seen someone like her rise to the forefront. But Jamila also realized that change wasn't just about being a public figure or giving speeches. Real, lasting change required people to confront their own biases, to reflect on the systems they had built, and to do the hard work of dismantling inequality piece by piece. It wasn't just about one bad principle. It was about a broader culture that had allowed those like him to thrive unchecked for so long. In the wake of her victory, Jamila worked tirelessly to create support networks for students, particularly students of color, who felt disenfranchised by the system. She pushed for new initiatives, advocated for more inclusive curricula, and even helped organize diversity workshops for faculty and staff. She knew that the fight would never be over as long as there were still people who felt unseen, unheard, or unimportant. Meanwhile, her family continued to heal, but the scars of the past few months remained. Karen, who had always been Jamila's strongest ally, began to see the toll that the fight for justice had taken on her daughter. Though Jamila had become a beacon of hope for many, Karen was concerned. She could see the exhaustion behind Jamila's eyes, the burden of carrying so much on her young shoulders. The world expected so much of her now. Jamila, for her part, felt a deep sense of responsibility, but often struggled with the weight of her newfound role. At night, when the protests had quieted and the rallies had ended, she found herself wondering whether she had done enough. She asked herself if this was truly her battle to fight, or if she had simply been thrust into a larger struggle that wasn't hers to bear. But each time that doubt crept in, she remembered the faces of the people who had stood by her, those who had been voiceless before and now had the courage to speak. And she knew, deep down, that she couldn't turn back. Then came the final twist. As Jamila continued to fight for the future of Oakwood High, the school district, fearing the ongoing backlash, started to implement reforms. The school board began to take seriously the calls for change. The district agreed to a comprehensive review of its disciplinary policies, which would include looking at how students of color had been disproportionately punished in the past. The results were slow to come, but it was a start. The administration implemented a series of new programs aimed at promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in the curriculum. It was clear that Oakwood High was at a crossroads, and the lessons from Jamila's fight were shaping the path forward. Jamila's journey had come full circle. She had gone from a quiet student who was unjustly expelled to a powerful force for change, someone who had redefined what it meant to stand up for what was right. She had not just fought for herself. She had fought for an entire community. And now, her influence stretched far beyond Oakwood High. She had become a symbol of the possibility for change in a world that too often turned a blind eye to injustice. As Jamila stood in front of the crowd at her graduation ceremony, her heart swelled with pride. She had made it. Against all odds, she had fought and won. But even as she looked toward the future, she knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice, for equality, and for the future of young people like her would continue. And she would be ready. With strength, resilience, and unwavering conviction, Jamila had rewritten her story. And, in the process, she had begun to rewrite the story of her entire community. She had become the change Oakwood High had desperately needed, and in doing so, she had proven that one person, one voice, could make an unimaginable difference.